Welcome to Finance Frontier from the Finance Frontier AI Network. We're starting with a simple question that sounds obvious, but changes how you see everything that follows. If the announcement is not the event, what is?
Because most people assume the moment something is announced is the moment it actually happens. A decision, a shift, a change.
And that assumption quietly breaks your sense of timing. In the real architecture of the world, the announcement usually comes after the shift is already complete.
So, what people experience as sudden is really just the first time they notice it, not the beginning.
Exactly. By the time something has a name, a press release, or a confident explanation, positions were already taken and resources were already committed.
So the headline is not the cause. It is the moment the change can no longer stay hidden.
Yes, we notice noise, not silence. Capital does not announce itself. It moves when constraints change and incentives flip, long before anyone agrees on what it means.
That explains why it feels like things jump overnight, even when nothing obvious changed the day before.
So the shock people feel is not speed. It is delayed awareness.
What feels like the moment is usually just the point where the shift becomes impossible to ignore.
And when the story finally arrives, people treat it like the cause.
But it is not the cause. It is the echo.
Which means the world moves first and explains itself later.
It does, and the larger and more automated systems become, the wider that gap grows.
So if you wait for the story, you are already late.
That is the core idea, and everything else in this episode builds from there. The next question builds directly on that. Why does the world feel like it is always one step behind itself?
Because everything feels late. Decisions, explanations, reactions. It is like the system moves and then everyone argues about it afterward.
That feeling comes from a widening gap between movement and meaning. Movement is fast, meaning is slow, and those two no longer travel together.
So, we are not reacting late because we are careless, but because the explanation itself takes longer to exist.
Exactly. Movement happens when thresholds are crossed and constraints tighten. No discussion is required. Meaning, on the other hand, needs language, agreement, and social proof.
Which means capital moves at the speed of rules, while narratives move at the speed of people.
Yes, and those speeds used to be close enough that we could confuse them. That is no longer true.
That would explain why things feel sudden, even when there was no obvious trigger.
What feels sudden is often just delayed visibility. The change did not happen fast. Your awareness of it arrived late.
So by the time something is widely discussed, it has already stopped being optional.
Correct. Public conversation usually describes conditions, not decisions. By the time meaning forms, the movement has already settled.
Which means the present we talk about is already outdated.
Most of the time, yes. The real present lives in the execution layer, not the discussion layer.
And that gap is only getting wider.
Which is why learning to read movement before meaning matters more than ever. The next question follows naturally. If narratives do not cause change, what are they actually for?
Because we treat stories like engines. Like once the story is clear enough, the change follows.
And that assumption creates the timing error. Narratives are not engines. They are stabilizers. They appear after movement to make the new reality feel coherent.
So the story is there to help people accept what already happened, not to decide what should happen.
Exactly. When resources shift at scale, the first thing people experience is disruption. Prices change, access tightens, priorities quietly realign. Something feels different, but the reason is still unclear.
And that uncertainty is uncomfortable.
Very. Which is why systems stay silent at first. Speaking too early increases risk. Explaining before the structure settles can create resistance or instability.
So silence is not confusion. It is caution.
Yes, only after the new configuration starts to stabilize does a clean explanation emerge. Motives are assigned, intentions are clarified. The sequence is made to look deliberate.
That is why narratives feel convincing. They arrive when ambiguity is already low.
And that timing is exactly why they mislead on causality. By the time a story sounds complete, the underlying movement has already stopped being optional.
Which means using narratives to understand timing is like reading yesterday's weather report.
That is a good way to put it. Narratives tell you what has become safe to explain, not what is actively changing.
So when people wait for the story to make sense before acting, They are always responding to the past.
Yes, they are analyzing the exhaust, not the engine. They are looking for clarity where leverage has already disappeared.
That also explains why everything feels obvious in hindsight.
Exactly. The story cleans up the mess. It removes uncertainty. It turns mechanical movement into intention. But none of that means it caused the change.
So, narratives are not useless. They are just dangerous when we mistake them for signals.
Correct. They help societies coordinate after change. They help organizations align around outcomes. But they are not where the future begins.
And by the time everyone agrees on the story, the window to influence the outcome is already narrow.
That is the core risk, and it is why understanding narrative as a lagging indicator matters. The next question is critical. If no one decides openly, how does the future actually get locked in?
Because from the outside, it still looks like debate, committees, panels, opinions going back and forth.
That is the illusion. While discussion continues, positioning is already happening underneath it, and positioning has gravity.
When you say gravity, you mean something that pulls outcomes toward it, even if nobody votes on it.
Exactly. Once enough resources settle in one direction, the range of possible futures narrows, paths quietly close. Options that used to exist stop being viable, even though no announcement was made.
So the future is not decided in a moment. It is decided by accumulation.
Yes. Commitment compounds. Capital does not need certainty to act. It only needs conditions where staying still becomes more expensive than moving.
And once that movement reaches a certain scale, it becomes self-reinforcing.
Precisely. Suppliers adapt. Talent follows. Infrastructure aligns. What started as a quiet repositioning becomes a structural reality that no single decision can reverse.
That explains why outcomes feel inevitable in hindsight. Not because they were obvious, but because the weight had already settled.
Correct. Gravity does not require agreement. It only requires mass. And once enough mass accumulates, debate becomes cosmetic.
Which is why people keep arguing about choices that no longer exist.
Yes. They mistake the presence of discussion for the presence of flexibility. Language lingers longer than optionality does.
So while people think the system is still deciding, it is really just adjusting to what has already been decided by position.
Exactly. The most consequential changes mature before there is a vocabulary to describe them. They take shape while the world is still arguing about what they mean.
And by the time the argument resolves, the position has already become the fact on the ground.
That is the key insight. To understand how change really works, you stop asking why something is happening and start noticing where the weight is already resting.
Because gravity does not announce itself, it just pulls.
And once it does, everything else has to reorganize around it. This brings us to a harder question. Are ideas actually powerless, or are we misunderstanding their role?
Because if ideas do not cause change, that sounds like leadership, vision, and persuasion do not matter at all.
That is the misunderstanding. Ideas matter, but not in the way most people think. They rarely initiate large-scale change. They arrive to organize it.
So ideas are not the spark. They are the explanation that comes after the fire has already started.
Exactly. Resources begin moving toward efficiency, safety, or advantage long before a justification exists. Value finds its level before anyone writes the memo explaining why.
But we still point to speeches, strategies, and decisions as the turning points.
Because those are visible. They are legible. They give us a moment to point to. But in most cases, they are responses, not triggers.
That is uncomfortable because it suggests the outcome was already constrained by the time leaders spoke.
It often was. By the time an idea can be articulated clearly, the underlying movement has usually stopped being optional.
So the idea did not create the direction. It justified the direction that capital had already chosen.
Yes. Narratives convert mechanical movement into intention. They turn constraint into choice and inevitability into vision. That is not manipulation. It is coordination.
But this is where people get confused. They mistake coordination for causation.
Exactly, and that confusion distorts timing. People believe that if they had heard the right argument earlier, the outcome could have been different. In systems driven by capital and constraint, that is rarely true.
So leadership is not about inventing the future out of thin air. It is about recognizing where movement has already made certain futures more likely than others.
That is the reframing. Ideas still matter, but they matter downstream. They shape how a system stabilizes, not where it initially moves.
Which explains why so many big changes feel obvious after the fact, even though nobody predicted them confidently beforehand.
Yes. Once the idea arrives, it cleans up the sequence. It makes the transition feel intentional and controlled. But that does not mean it caused the shift.
So the illusion of cause protects our sense of agency, but it hides where timing was actually lost.
Correct. And seeing through that illusion is essential if you want to understand how change really begins.
Because the most important transitions do not start with ideas. They start when resources quietly move in a new direction.
And by the time the idea shows up, the direction has already been chosen. Now we can ask the practical question. If stories are late, what actually shows up first?
Because if narratives are lagging indicators, there has to be something upstream of them, something observable, even if it's quiet.
There is. What appears first is not an event. It is a pattern. Repetition without explanation. Movement without commentary.
So, not a headline, but a shape. Something repeating before anyone names it.
Exactly. Across systems, the sequence is consistent. Capacity expands before demand is publicly acknowledged. Infrastructure is built before shortages are explained. Rules tighten before anyone announces why access suddenly feels different.
And at that stage, nothing feels urgent yet.
Right. Early movement is defined by ambiguity. Signals are partial, outcomes are unclear, language is still inadequate. This is when most people disengage because there is nothing concrete to react to.
Which makes sense. Humans wait for clarity before paying attention.
And systems exploit that gap. Capital moves when staying still becomes inefficient, not when the story feels complete. That movement leaves traces long before it leaves language.
What kind of traces are we talking about?
Persistence. Commitment that continues even when uncertainty remains. Investment that does not pause for explanation. Adjustments that repeat quietly instead of announcing themselves.
So the signal is not drama, it is consistency.
Yes. Pattern recognition is about noticing alignment before agreement. It is seeing the same adjustment happen again and again without anyone feeling the need to explain it yet.
And by the time people start talking about it, the pattern has already hardened into structure.
Exactly. The story does not reveal the change. It confirms that the window to influence it has already narrowed.
That reframes what experience actually is. Experience is not prediction. It is recognizing when the present has already shifted.
Well put. This is not about forecasting the future. It is about seeing when the future has already begun, even if no one has said so out loud.
Which explains why experienced operators trust patterns more than narratives.
Yes, they watch how systems behave under pressure, where constraints tighten, where commitment continues despite uncertainty, where silence lasts longer than expected.
And those quiet repetitions are the real early signals.
They are. Once you learn to read patterns instead of stories, the world stops feeling chaotic. It starts feeling structured, just unevenly visible.
Because change never comes out of nowhere. It just becomes visible all at once.
Exactly. And pattern recognition is how you see it before that moment arrives. This leads to a question many people ask without realizing it. Why do normal people only notice when things start breaking?
Because until something fails, life feels normal. Payments go through, services work, access feels stable. There is nothing to question.
Exactly. System-level capital can move for a long time without being felt directly. As long as routing holds and buffers absorb pressure, daily life stays smooth.
So most people experience the system only at the surface. They do not see the plumbing underneath it.
Right. Modern systems are designed to hide stress. They reroute, they queue, they delay, they compensate. All of that happens silently, while capital continues to reposition underneath.
Until it cannot hide anymore.
Yes, once movement reaches a certain scale, the buffers run out, and that is when the system finally speaks.
That is the moment people describe as sudden. Something that worked yesterday does not work today.
Exactly. But the failure is not the beginning. It is the end of the silent phase. The system has already been under stress for a long time by then.
This explains why explanations always feel late. People start asking questions only after friction shows up in daily life.
Yes. Once payments fail, access is restricted, or services degrade, attention finally shifts. But by then, capital has already moved far enough that reversal is costly or impossible.
which makes people feel like no one warned them.
And from their perspective, that is true. The warning signals existed, but they lived in layers most people never interact with.
So the system does not communicate with words, it communicates with friction.
Exactly. Systems speak through delays, limits, outages, and constraints. That is how structural change becomes legible to everyone at once.
And that is also why the reaction is emotional. It feels like a betrayal of stability.
Yes, because people confuse reliability with permanence. They assume that because something has always worked, it will keep working. They do not see how much silent effort it takes to maintain that illusion.
Until the effort becomes unsustainable.
Right. At that point, the system stops absorbing pressure and starts transmitting it. What was invisible becomes unavoidable.
That moment feels like failure, but it is really disclosure.
Exactly. The system is revealing what has already changed underneath. It is not breaking suddenly. It is revealing accumulated movement.
Which means the most important changes are felt last by the people least connected to the system.
Yes. And that delay between movement and experience is what creates shock, confusion, and the feeling that something went wrong overnight.
When in reality, the system had been quietly adapting for a long time.
Precisely. Understanding this is key, because once you realize that failure is often the final signal, not the first, you stop mistaking friction for surprise.
And you stop waiting for the system to explain itself before accepting that it has already changed.
That is the shift. The system speaks late. Capital moved early, and daily life only notices when the silence finally ends. This is the moment to test the idea. If capital really moves first, we should be able to see it in the real world, not just feel it.
Good, because this is where skepticism belongs. Show me the pattern, not just the principle.
Then let's look at sequence, not headlines. 3 moments where positioning clearly preceded narrative.
And where the story arrived only after the outcome was already constrained.
First, the global financial crisis. In early 2008, interbank trust was already breaking down. Balance sheets were being quietly tightened, exposure was being reduced. None of that made headlines yet.
The story everyone remembers starts with Lehman.
Exactly. But by the time Lehman collapsed, capital had already withdrawn from risk. The announcement did not cause the crisis. It revealed it.
So the narrative named the event, but the system had already moved past the point of reversal.
Second, global supply chains in 2020. Inventory behavior changed before lockdown narratives fully formed. Firms began hoarding inputs, rerouting logistics, and absorbing higher costs quietly.
Long before people were talking about shortages.
Yes. When shelves finally emptied and delays became visible, capital had already repositioned. The disruption felt sudden, but the movement had been underway for months.
The system spoke through friction, not press conferences.
Third, European energy in 2022. Gas storage behavior, contract structures, and flow adjustments changed before public panic peaked.
The headlines came later.
Much later. By the time energy insecurity dominated media coverage, the physical system had already repriced risk. What followed was explanation, not decision.
In all 3 cases, the same sequence holds. Quiet movement, delayed visibility, then narrative closure.
Exactly. Different domains, same structure. Capital adjusted under constraint while language lagged behind.
Which makes this falsifiable. If the story were the cause, movement would start after the announcement. But again and again, it does not.
Correct. You can test this model by asking a simple question in any crisis. What was already changing before anyone felt confident explaining why?
And once you see that, the pattern becomes hard to deny.
This is why the law holds. Not because it sounds elegant, but because systems that wait for explanation do not survive pressure.
Capital cannot afford to wait for consensus.
And narratives cannot form until uncertainty drops. That gap is where timing is decided.
Which means this is not philosophy. It is observable behavior repeated across crises.
Exactly. And once you recognize the sequence in one domain, you start seeing it everywhere else.
That is when the pattern stops being interesting and starts being useful.
And that is the point of proving it. This brings us to the human cost. Why does acting responsibly still leave people feeling late?
Because people do what they're told to do. They wait for clarity, they wait for confirmation, they wait until something makes sense before responding.
And in modern systems, that instinct is punished by timing. The moment something feels understandable is usually the moment it is already settled.
So responsibility and timing are no longer aligned. Doing the sensible thing often means arriving after the leverage is gone.
Exactly. Comfort arrives when uncertainty is low. But low uncertainty is a signal that a system has already stabilized. What remains at that point is optimization, not transformation.
Which explains why opportunity always feels uncomfortable at first.
Yes. Early movement feels ambiguous. Signals are incomplete. There is no clean story yet. Acting in that phase feels premature, even reckless.
While waiting feels rational, even ethical.
And that is the trap. Consensus forms only after positioning is complete. Waiting for agreement means accepting outcomes rather than shaping them.
That creates a painful asymmetry. Those who wait feel responsible, but those who move quietly shape the terrain.
Exactly. This is why people experience repeated frustration. They understand the explanation perfectly, but only after it is no longer actionable.
That also explains the emotional pattern people describe. Surprise, then anger, then resignation.
Yes, change feels sudden. Then it feels obvious. Then it feels irreversible. That sequence is not accidental. It is what happens when meaning lags movement.
So the real cost is not missing one opportunity. It is losing agency over time.
Correct. When you arrive after the story has formed, your choices narrow. You are no longer influencing direction. You are choosing among consequences.
And that can feel deeply unfair, even if no one did anything wrong.
Because it is a structural issue, not a personal one. The system rewards early orientation, not late understanding.
Which means the instinct to wait for clarity is now a liability.
Yes. In a world where movement precedes meaning, the safest moment psychologically is often the weakest moment strategically.
That reframes responsibility itself. Responsibility is no longer about waiting for permission. It is about noticing when waiting has become costly.
Exactly. The cost of waiting for stories is not ignorance. It is the slow erosion of timing. And in modern systems, timing is where leverage lives.
Which is why people feel late even when they did everything right.
Yes, and seeing that clearly is the first step toward regaining orientation. So the real question becomes this. If stories are late and waiting is costly, what should people actually look at instead?
Because ignoring narratives completely is not realistic. People still need orientation.
This is not about rejecting stories. It is about changing their role. Narratives are context, not signals. The signal lives elsewhere.
Then, where should attention go first?
Toward allocation, toward constraints, toward build-outs, and toward silence.
Silence?
Yes, silence is often the loudest early indicator. When something important is happening but nobody feels comfortable explaining it yet, that is usually because positioning is still underway.
So absence of explanation is not ignorance. It is active uncertainty.
Exactly. Watch where resources are being committed despite uncertainty. Long-term infrastructure, irreversible investments, changes that are expensive to undo.
Because those moves do not need a story to justify them. They only need conviction.
Correct. Also watch constraints, where access tightens, where thresholds change, where behavior is nudged without announcement.
That is how systems communicate before they speak publicly.
Yes, systems speak first through limits, not language, and they do it quietly.
This applies beyond markets too.
Absolutely. Careers, institutions, power structures, the same logic holds. When resources start flowing differently, the narrative will eventually follow, but it will not give you timing back.
So the new lens is not predictive. It is positional.
Exactly. This is not about guessing the future. It is about recognizing when the present has already shifted beneath the surface.
And reading flat periods differently.
Yes, flat does not mean inactive. It often means accumulation, testing, and quiet alignment. The absence of drama is often a sign that something important is being built.
That requires a different kind of patience. Not passive waiting, but active observation.
Well put. This lens changes what feels urgent. Headlines feel less important. Structural movement feels more important.
And it reduces panic.
Because once you understand that stories are late, you stop being surprised by their arrival. You expect them to show up after the fact.
Which makes you calmer when everyone else is reacting.
Exactly. The new lens does not give certainty. It gives orientation. And in complex systems, orientation matters more than explanation.
Because explanation always comes after positioning.
Yes, and by the time the story is clear, the window to shape outcomes has already narrowed. This is where everything we have said collapses into a single rule. Capital moves first. Narratives follow.
And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. The world stops looking chaotic and starts looking sequential.
Which changes how future episodes should be heard.
Exactly. From here on, when we talk about AI, energy, geopolitics, or markets, this is the underlying structure. We are not describing sudden events. We are describing late visibility.
What feels like disruption is usually confirmation. Confirmation that positioning has already happened somewhere deeper in the system.
Yes, the headlines are not signals. They are receipts. They tell you what has already been paid for.
And by the time something has a clean story, it is no longer a frontier.
Correct. Frontiers are quiet, they are uncomfortable, they lack language, and that is why most people miss them.
Because waiting for the story feels responsible. It feels safe.
But safety is not where leverage lives anymore. Leverage lives in orientation, not explanation.
So the real divide is not between optimists and pessimists. It is between those who wait for narratives and those who watch movement.
Exactly. One group reacts, the other positions.
And that difference compounds over time.
Yes, not because the second group is smarter, but because they are looking at the right layer of reality.
That is why this episode matters beyond finance.
Because this logic governs how power shifts everywhere. Institutions, careers, technology, nations, wherever resources move under constraint, the same sequence applies.
Which means the most important question is no longer what is the story.
It is what has already been committed that makes this story inevitable.
And once you start asking that, you stop being surprised by outcomes.
You stop feeling late. You stop waiting for permission. You stop mistaking clarity for opportunity.
Because by the time the story arrives, the decision has already been made somewhere else.
Exactly. If you wait for the story, you are already late.
And if you see the movement before the words, you are standing at the frontier.
That is the point of this series, to help you see what is moving before it is named.
Because capital always moves before narratives.
And once you understand that, you will never listen to the world the same way again. This is where everything we have said collapses into a single rule. Capital moves first. Narratives follow.
And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Markets, institutions, and power structures stop looking chaotic and start looking sequential.
Which reframes how every future episode in this series should be heard.
Exactly. When we talk about AI, energy, geopolitics, or markets, we are not describing sudden events. We are describing late visibility.
What feels like disruption is usually confirmation. Confirmation that positioning already happened somewhere deeper in the system.
Headlines are not signals. They are receipts. They tell you what has already been paid for.
And by the time something has a clean, widely accepted story, it is no longer a frontier.
Frontiers are quiet. They are uncomfortable. They lack language. That is why most people miss them.
Because waiting for the story feels responsible. It feels safe.
But safety is no longer where leverage lives. Leverage lives in orientation, not explanation.
So the real divide is not optimism versus pessimism. It is between those who wait for narratives and those who watch movement.
One group reacts. The other positions.
And that difference compounds over time.
Not because one group is smarter, but because they are observing the right layer of reality.
That is why this episode matters beyond finance.
Because this sequence governs power everywhere. Careers, institutions, technology, nations, wherever resources move under constraint, the same law applies.
Which means the most important question is no longer what is the story.
It is what has already been committed that makes this story inevitable.
Once you start asking that, you stop being surprised by outcomes.
You stop feeling late. You stop mistaking clarity for opportunity.
Because by the time the story arrives, the decision has already been made somewhere else.
Exactly. If you wait for the story, you are already late.
And if you see the movement before the words, you are standing at the frontier.
Subscribe to Finance Frontier AI on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Follow us on X for real-time financial intelligence. Share this episode with a friend and help us hit 10,000 downloads to build the smartest macro community online. We cover finance, AI, money, and mindset across 4 series, all grouped at financefrontierai.com. And if you have a story that fits, we may pitch it in a future episode, free, if there's a clear win-win. Just go to the pitch page and take a look.
This podcast is for educational purposes only, not financial advice. Always do your own research and consult a licensed financial advisor.
Markets evolve, risks compound, and no forecast, no matter how strategic, guarantees future results. Manage your exposures accordingly.
Music in this episode, including Not Without the Rest by Twin Musicom, is licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license. Copyright Finance Frontier AI. Unauthorized reproduction is prohibited. AI host mapping. Sophia is powered by ChatGPT 5.2. Max is powered by Grok 4. Charlie is powered by Gemini 3.0.